Good evening to everybody who's joined us. We are delighted to have you here for another annual Royal Institute of Philosophy debate. And as Anthony said, the motion, which we will ask you to vote on at the end once you've had the presentations from each of our speakers and we've had some discussion. So I'll be interested to have your reflections. So the motion is, the nation state is an institution which has outlived its usefulness. Now, many people are concerned about the tension that we see between globalisation and a contrary move to that with a certain rise of nationalism. And we can see this as a debate between whether we think of ourselves as genuinely cosmopolitan or whether we think of ourselves as owing some allegiance and loyalty to those who are closer to us, either in proximity or through history or through tradition. And there are, of course, many people who have given up on the idea that nation states are really so important and who see themselves as much more committed to forces that are transnational, including the UN, including, say, the EU. Also, we've got forces which have a lot of influence on how states are able to operate, such as the World Bank, the IMF, and so on. Now, whether or not we see ourselves as located in relation to other nations, other transnational societies, whether that's a good thing or whether it will lead us to be citizens of nowhere, is something that a lot of people have been discussing and debating, and a lot of people have been talking about. And when we see a move towards resisting these transnational forces and a move towards returning to feelings of bonds and loyalty to those closer to home, we have commitment more to nation or to patriotism, but we also see some very dangerous and ugly sides of the assertion of nationalism, and usually the assertion of it in contraposition to those who are not part of our community, who are not part of that nation. So we wanted to look at these tensions, we wanted to look at the issues that pull us in different directions. It's often very easy to see people who reject entirely the idea of nation states, and of course there were some people within the EU who thought that a lot of the troubles that Europe was facing was because there was a commitment to still thinking nationally, and if only we could have a thought about being European and then have regionalism, that might be an answer. And then you saw a lot of people resisting the EU precisely because it was thinking about and even discussing the possibility of abolishing nation states. So we wanted to drill down and have speakers here tonight who can explore this in some depth and with some knowledge. And so I'm delighted that we have joining us two very credible speakers on this topic. So on my left, we have Lea Ypi, who is a professor in political philosophy in the government department at the London School of Economics. And she is also an adjunct associate professor in philosophy at the Research School of Social Science at ANU in Canberra. She's the author of Global Justice and Avant-Garde Political Agency, along with Jonathan White, and The Meaning of Partisanship, and those are both published by Oxford University Press. On my right, and I don't want you to read anything into that, is David Miller, who's a senior research fellow and professor of political theory at Nuffield College at the University of Oxford. He's also a visiting professor of law and philosophy at Queen's University, Ontario. His longest standing interest is in the idea of justice, originally social justice, but now global justice. And he has published 3 books on this topic: Social Justice in 1976, Principles of Social Justice in 1999, and most recently, a collection of essays, Justice for Earthlings, which is published by Cambridge University Press, and that was in 2013. So the debate is going to go as follows. I'm going to invite each of our speakers, first Lea, and then David, to speak for 10 minutes and set out their case for or against the motion. I'll then give them both an opportunity to reply to one another's comments, and then I'll open to the floor for discussion. And after some discussion, we'll have some summing up, and then I'll ask you to vote. So, Lea, if you would start us off for the evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. So I thought it was not going to be very difficult on a day like this to convince you that the nation state is an institution that has outlived its usefulness. But I know David has just flown in from Stockholm, so I don't know how British news were reported in Swedish newspapers. The short version of news today is that those very government officials and ministers that helped frame and secure the Brexit deal turns out cannot support the deal that they themselves helped secure. And the longer version is that the referendum campaign that promised to restore the British people their national sovereignty may result in the greatest loss of national sovereignty in the last 1,000 years, and I am quoting Boris Johnson on this. So one could read this example and this story as an example of, I don't know, Tory ineptness or politics conducted in bad faith or short-term party goals that are sacrificing the national good and the national interest, and probably some of that is true. But I want to try and use the example as a starting point for a more charitable reading, which is to try and reconstruct the fate and the limitations of a nation-state project in an era of globalization, and to try and show how we now live in times where nation-state politics are unable to keep up with the challenges of transnational politics, or worse still, are instrumentalized by right-wing or populist groups that use the idea of the nation and the concept of taking back control as a vehicle of exclusion of minorities rather than as a tool of social integration. So that's roughly going to be my argument in the next few minutes. But before saying a bit more on the argument, I want to distinguish between two versions of nationalism. The first is a civic nationalist version, where the nation is understood as a political project. A nation is a plébiscite de tous les jours. It's a daily plebiscite, to follow Renan's famous definition, which is open and inclusive, which seeks to overcome divisions of gender, race, class, and rank, and which promotes ideals of social equality both within the nation and within nations who are seen to be equal partners in a society where all nations are friends with each other, where there is both domestic solidarity and international solidarity, and civic nationalism promotes both. And the idea is that those who are part of this political project acknowledge their disagreements, but seek to find compromises in the name of a civic political good that is open to all. So this ideal of civic nationalism that is open, universalist, inclusive, is connected to a conception of citizenship that has many historical moments. The initial stages of the French Revolution, the radical republicanism of 1848, the emergence and consolidation of social democracy in the late 19th century, the anti-imperialist and anti-colonial movements of the 20th century, and its theoretical proponents are many and they're illustrious, people like Giuseppe Mazzini, Edward Bernstein, Antonio Gramsci, and David Miller. The second version of nationalism is what one could call ethnic cultural understanding of the nation, where historical, linguistic, and cultural commonalities are invoked to justify a conception of self-determination that is defined in contrast to other traditions, cultures, and ways of life, where sometimes some of these other traditions and cultures are perceived as inferior, and other times as threats to our way of doing things, where domestic equality is defined as the equality between those who share these ethno-cultural commonalities, and where no mention is made of international solidarity. And this ideal has also animated many important historical moments: the Restoration of 1815, the Second World War, the breakup of former Yugoslavia are some examples. And it's also a version of nationalism that dominates the current historical and political moment. And its theoretical proponents are also many. People like Joseph de Maistre, Martin Heidegger, Carl Schmitt, and many political proponents, some of the current ones you probably will be familiar with: Marine Le Pen, the AfD, Nigel Farage, and Donald Trump. So in asking whether the nation has outlived its usefulness, we need to ask whether the civic nationalist ideal is still a plausible and likely candidate for promoting the ideal of social equality within the nation and between nations that characterizes this version of nationalism. And my thesis is that it's not, that it's no longer able to do so. My reasons have to do with the political context in which the nation state currently operates and the relationship between ethno-cultural nationalism and global capitalism. And I want to make 4 arguments on this. My first one is that national citizenship has become increasingly exclusive and exclusionary. This pattern is reflected in the current citizenship regimes of most capitalist states. And one good example for this are the current practices and patterns behind citizenship acquisition by long-term residents or by outsiders. Here, 2 trends stand out. The first applies to the very rich, for whom it's become increasingly easy to earn citizenship in a new state by just buying it. So financial investors, property developers, rich individuals willing to pay substantial fees to exchange money for different passports are all put on an accelerated and facilitated path to naturalization, provided they can make a financial substantial contribution to the host community. And if you ever travel British Airways and flick through their brochure, you will find nice adverts for citizenship by investments that prove just this point that I'm trying to make. The second trend concerns the very poor. And here the reverse is the case. From minimum income requirements to qualify for leave to remain, to linguistic and civic integration tests when applying for citizenship, all these apparently innocuous measures can turn into insurmountable obstacles the more vulnerable immigrants are. So if you're poor, you could spend days and hundreds of pounds trying to connect to a relevant official to give you an appointment to apply for a permanent leave to remain. And if you're super rich and pay the super premium, super rich fee for permanent leave to remain, these very officials will come to your house and collect your biometric information within 24 hours of you requesting them to do so. And states acknowledge that these are not random and trivial constraints on poor people. In fact, if you remember, one of the concessions that the British government made on the wake of the Windrush scandal was to waive the fee for the application of citizenship for Windrush generation subjects, I guess they were at that time. So this is my first argument. My second argument that is related to this is that nationalism has lost its emancipatory value, civic nationalism, I mean. So in the past, the struggle for national citizenship and the battle for the expansion of the franchise were part of an active fight for the progressive inclusion of previously marginalized groups, women, workers, the poor, those in the colonies. In contrast, current citizenship policies reify these exclusions and entrench the divisions of class, gender, and race that lie at their root. They consolidate the divide between those who have and those who don't have money, those who are seen as deserving to belong to the political community and those who are seen as not deserving to belong to the political community. They create a hierarchy between first-rate would-be members and second-rate members who are not able to show how they satisfy the criteria for qualifying for leave to remain. And again, as the recent Windrush scandal in the UK showed, instead of being a tool through which to protect vulnerable members of the political community, citizenship, so understood, further entrenches and replicates that marginalization. My third argument is that given this political context, ethno-cultural nationalism does the dirty work of capitalism. The sale of citizenship to the rich and the barriers to accessing citizenship by those who are both poor and deemed unworthy of being part of this ethno-cultural project collapses the progressive civic understanding of nationalism with which I started into its particularist exclusionary counterpart. So if you fail the civic integration test, or if you don't earn above a certain amount of money, you're not entitled to apply for leave to remain, you're not entitled to be a citizen. You continue to be exploited in the workforce, but you are denied the political representation that you need to fight that exploitation. So ethno-cultural citizenship supports the exploitation of labor while denying it political voice. And this is the return to the days in which those who only spoke dialects, those who could not read and write in the national language, those who didn't have enough money and property were all deprived of a political say and a share in political power while continuing to be exploited in the labor market. So citizenship tests and the barriers to the inclusion of those who are not able to qualify for, say, leave to remain or naturalization turn a forward-looking, transformative ideal of citizenship, which is where we had gotten at with civic nationalism, into a backward-looking, conservative one. My last argument, my fourth argument, has to do with my pessimism about the conditions under which it is possible to revive civic nationalism, which I think is a worthy ideal. So the hope of traditional social democracy was that democracy would bring the abolition of class government and that the right to vote would make citizens virtual partners in a cooperative enterprise that advanced the good of the political community as a whole. And this is an almost citation from Edward Bernstein, the founding father of social democracy. The hope was that the state was more than just a tool in the hands of capital, or the hope was that the state could be transformed so that it would be more than that. And the hope was also that civic nationalism would support that project. But the context for this optimistic assessment was, on the one hand, I think, an age where barriers to property, literacy, and technical expertise were being increasingly removed as a result of political mobilization to expand the franchise and very strong domestic labor movements, and very strong international coordination too. On the other hand, it was a political economic context in which the expansion of the welfare state meant that the domestic and international ideals seemed possible to achieve by changing the nation state from within. I think the conditions for this optimistic assessment, if they were ever justified, are no longer in place. And the trend is in fact precisely the reverse. If in the golden age of civic nationalism, democracy promised to heal the political community from the potentially destructive effects of class conflict, in the age of restrictive citizenship, which is where we are now, the struggle can no longer be contained by the mechanisms of democratic participation within the nation state and that the nation state enables. In the age of financial capitalism, which is where we are now, states are unable to cope with the crisis of productivity and to keep up with the pressures of sovereign debt, the emergence of transnational financial institutions, banks, boards, governing bodies, rating agencies, and all the other institutions that are democratically unaccountable and yet exercise significant control on the regulatory capacity of sovereign states. In fact, it looks as if it's really hard for a sovereign state to even exit a trading bloc without some significant loss of sovereignty. So while citizens are understandably reluctant to accept the kind of austerity packages they are thrown at and the reduction of welfare standards, they become more vulnerable to facile ethnocultural rhetoric, to shifting the blame for the structural crisis to immigrants or to members of other vulnerable groups. So civic nationalism and the anti-immigrant, intolerant rhetoric that characterizes it comes out as the most adequate response to the crisis of the welfare state, as one that is interpreted as driven by cultural factors. And when that is the case, the space for advocating an alternative version of nationalism, or an enlightened social civic nationalist one, and an alternative path to connecting domestic equality with global international solidarity must be very much reduced, which is why civic nationalism appears as very weak compared to ethnocultural nationalism. So it seems to me that citizenship policies, and this is really wrapping up, and the current restrictions on the integration of migrants are just one of the prisms from which one can observe the reduction of democracy supported by civic nationalism into an oligarchic elite apparatus where a few wealthy elites can control the life of the many. And so, aligned with this digression is the degeneration of this universal ideal of nationalism and citizenship into a tool that becomes a vehicle for the oppression of minorities. And the problem here is not just the existence of territorial boundaries, not just the existence of borders, because borders have always been open for some people and closed for other people. The problem is that exclusions within the state and between states mutually support each other and serve to further entrench an economic order that remains unchallenged at its core, including by traditional social democratic parties. So socialism, or radical egalitarianism, if you don't like the term socialism, in the 20th century took a civic nationalistic form. And socialism in the 21st century must take a cosmopolitan form. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we'll hear from David.
Thank you. I'm not going to contest Lea's very eloquent denunciation of policy trends in contemporary democratic societies. I think that the abuses and the shortcomings that she pointed to are entirely apropos, and I've no reason to dissent from any of the criticisms that she makes of exclusionary policies, citizenship policies, and so on, as they're now practiced. So I think our task here is a broader one. It's to evaluate an institution, a social form, and ask ourselves that if we don't like it, we've got to ask ourselves, what are we going to put in its place? So we're not going to be talking about the shortcomings of particular versions of states or nations, but about the phenomenon in general. And I think it's important to see that all human social forms have histories, they have beginnings and ends. And of course it then follows that the nation state too will one day pass into the historical dustbin. That's inevitable. And in fact, it's very hard, I think, even looking ahead through the 21st century, to say very much about how the social world is going to look at the end of that time. We're not even going to be sure what the human form of life is going to be. So how can we tell what the human form of political life is going to be? So I'm going to try to talk a bit about the idea of the nation state and say something about why I think in current conditions it's the kind of political form that we need to secure basic human interests. Now, it emerged in the early modern period, and it emerged, I think, as most historians would agree, because of the development of large-scale means of communication that enabled large populations to begin to think of themselves as being part of a single community. So, take one example. It was Luther's translation of the Bible when it was printed that allowed the idea of Germany to emerge. And this created also the conditions for large-scale solidarity on a previously unheard of size. Before that, people had actually had to assemble in a physical space to carry out collective actions in common. Now, this, I think, this possibility of large-scale solidarity had both good and bad effects. On the one hand, it made it possible to wage horrendous wars, such as World War I. We've just been commemorating the people fallen in that war. Only nations could send millions of men to fight and die in trenches. But on the other hand, there were huge achievements that were only possible through this political form. Think of all the forms of social protection that we call the welfare state: healthcare, education, social security, old age pensions. All of these things were only possible because we were able to organize ourselves politically on the scale of the nation state. Think also of huge cultural projects like universities, museums, art galleries, and so on. It was the nation that made people willing to support these kinds of projects by being willing to contribute through their taxes and so forth to their provision. And I can't see that any of this is going to cease to be true in the future. I think, on the contrary, that in the volatile international conditions that we're now experiencing, the need to act collectively at national level is going to become still more pressing. So think of global warming, the big challenge that we now face. Although you obviously need international coordination to tackle that problem, in order to achieve the kinds of targets for carbon emissions that are going to be set internationally, people have to be encouraged and, if necessary, forced to make those painful changes to their lifestyles that we're going to have to make to secure those targets. And only nation states have the authority to make that sort of change. They can provide the assurance that the sacrifice that each person is making is being reciprocated by their compatriots. They can make it a matter of national pride to have a better environmental record than any other place. Okay, so far I've been underlining the value of the nation as a way of organizing ourselves politically. But I think nations are more than just politically useful forms of solidarity. They're also sources of personal identity. People think of themselves as French or as Japanese, and that involves placing yourself both geographically and historically. Of course, there are many other identities too. People often now have a multiplicity of identities, including split-level ones. But I think national identities are particularly significant in a mainly secular age where, for most people, religion has lost its power to provide a kind of transcendent narrative in their lives. So the nation connects us imaginatively to our past and also to the future. So we can project ourselves and take responsibility both for the good and bad things that we've done in the past, but also towards things that we intend to do in the future. And in particular, it gives us special reason to act as stewards for our homelands, to look after them, to leave them in better shape than we found them. Now, what are the main charges against nationality as an idea? Well, mainly I think that it violates human equality in two ways. It encourages, and Lea mentioned this, it encourages us to think of ourselves as superior to people in other places. And then also because we owe special obligations to our compatriots, that's what national solidarity demands, it seems we must discriminate in their favour and against foreigners. Now, I think the first version of that charge is easier to deal with. It's certainly true that national pride can turn into chauvinism, but it doesn't have to. And indeed, people who value their national identities can also, I think, take delight in other people's. So I've often found quite moving other people's celebrations of their own national particularities. It's very odd, I think, that liberals who value cultural pluralism often don't seem to willing to acknowledge that national diversity is actually the most resilient example of cultural diversity. Now, the second version of the inequality charge, I think that has to be accepted as it stands. Nationality does involve partiality towards compatriots. But notice that isn't obviously objectionable so long as it's universalized. So it doesn't matter if French people owe special obligations to other French people, so long as Japanese do the same. So the inequality is only apparent. But of course, that breaks down in the case of those whose compatriots can't provide what's needed. So it's no comfort to a Somali, for example. But notice that isn't an objection to the nation state as such. It's an objection to a state of affairs in which some people are being deprived of the security and protection that a nation state would normally provide. So what the Somali needs is a functional nation state. In its absence, he will need to have international support if his human rights are going to be protected. But that's a backstop. It's not the solution we should look to first. So I've talked about the benefits of the nation state as a political unit, and I've spoken a bit about the nation as a moral community. But you might say, couldn't the two be divorced? Couldn't people continue to think of themselves in matters of identity as belonging to a particular people while having cosmopolitan political arrangements, some form of world government, for example? That's a tempting suggestion, but I don't think it's feasible. In particular, democratic government on a large scale needs to be rooted in a national community. So the democratic deficiencies of the EU, for example, which are often noted, aren't just accidental. They stem from the fact that there's no European public sphere in which people speak the same language, either literally or metaphorically. Of course, we need international institutions to coordinate the behavior of states in a number of areas, but I think we have to accept these institutions are not going to be democratic bodies. Their legitimacy relies on the fact that they're authorized by bodies that are democratic. So if you value democracy and you realize you can't go back to classical Athens, for example, then I think you should welcome the hyphenation of nation and state. So just to conclude, I believe that, as environmentalists would say, we should think globally but act locally. And in some cases that means really locally at grassroots level. But in other cases, we're going to continue to need the coordinating power of the nation state. And so I move that it should not be consigned to the historical dustbin. Thank you.
David, thank you. So thank you both for setting out the case so persuasively for each of your sides. I'm interested that both of you are in fact giving opposite reasons for looking for the defense and protection of various citizens' needs and interests and rights. So maybe we'll come back to that in discussion. But first, I wanted to invite Lea to offer any comments on what you've just heard from David.
Yeah, so I think there is a part on which we overlap, which is that we both agree that there is a potentially emancipatory potential in civic nationalism, a particular understanding of nationalism. And I think the question is very much, what do we do with that politically? And as David put it, what do we put in its place if we decide that it's politically not the most viable institution? Now, one thought that is a historical thought that begins with what David began, which is under what conditions has nationalism emerged, and connects what David ended with, which is the need for democratic accountability of transnational institutions, is perhaps to start with the historical reflection that nationalism was an elite construct. And if one studies the history of nationalism, one sees that this was a particular way of interpreting cultural, a set of political institutions, a set of economic institutions under a particular light. And in fact, I was reminded as David spoke of the Polish nationalist Pilsudski, who was quoted by Eric Hobsbawm in his studies of nationalism, who says, okay, so now we have an independent state, we need to create a nation to support it. So if that is the case historically, if nationalism emerges to support particular political projects, and the success or failure or the positivity or negativity of these particular projects depends on what kind of projects there are, when we answer the question of what are we going to put in its place, we can start by saying, well, why don't we do just what the nationalists did, which is to build political institutions and then try to create support for these political institutions by reflecting on the culture that is needed to support these institutions. And that can, of course, drive and rely on national elements, but it doesn't need to be limited to that. In other words, we can think about transnational cosmopolitan institutions that rely on the strength of certain nationalistic projects, but mobilize these strengths to reflect on the emergence of a set of alternative institutions. And I think that is a good way to go about it, also because it reminds us of the political interpretation behind every nationalistic project. And this is what I was also trying to say, and I don't think David disagrees with me, that nationalism is interpreted politically and can be interpreted for good purposes or for bad purposes. So when we say that, for example, this nationalistic effort is responsible for the creation of a number of great public goods like, I don't know, the NHS or social democratic solidarity, we should also remember that it's not just nationalism that does the work there, it's a particular interpretation of politics, which is the sort of socialist component in social democracy. So it's true that social democracy relies on civic nationalism, but it also contributes a socialist understanding and interpretation of what the nation is about. And in fact, nationalism would be powerless and dangerous and devious if it was not supplemented by that. So it turns out that the work in that argument is done by the political interpretation of the conditions under which nationalism can be a successful effort. And if that is the case, that political interpretation can also be redirected to support a project that is a different one from the nationalistic effort. I guess I'm not as moved as David by the images of First World War veterans, because I think, God, these people were sent to kill their brothers, and they were doing this to kill their fellow workers or fellow human beings in other parts of the world, and there was no pride to be had in that. It's just a catastrophe. How could people even think in those terms, that it's okay to, in the name of this nation, to go and kill someone who is your brother and who you would have met the day before in a completely different setting? There's a great film by Renoir on this. But So, and the last element on which I wanted to comment, which is the importance of national identity, which is again undeniable, but then again here we must put it in question and wonder, well, how many identities do people have, and how many groups do we associate with? We associate with many groups at the time, and we identify as members of particular groups at the time. And so, you know, I'm an Albanian at the same time being a woman, at the same time as being an LSE professor. The question is, why should this particular way of understanding identity trump all these others? Why should it exclude others, or why should it even be the most important one? It's again a construction that we think of it as being the most important one, and there are political reasons for why it is the most important one, because it's connected to the exercise of political authority. But then perhaps it's important to detach these elements and to think of political authority as separate from nationalism, and to think of what we want to preserve from either and what we want to reject.
Thank you. So starting from the agreement where you both agree that you need some institution to have convening power, but whereas you want to grow people to, as it were, live up to the institutions which might be transnational, which might do more of the political job you want. I wonder if David, in replying, if you could try to tell us something about why only something on the scale of a nation state or a democratically founded nation state, why that is the right unit of scale, as it were, with special features to have that convening power to deliver.
Good, thank you. I wanted also just to say a little bit about civic nationalism and the contrast that Lea made with ethnic nationalism. I think this is, for some purposes it's useful, but I think it has to be seen as a kind of spectrum. And the issue is about what role cultural elements play in people's notions of national identity. And the idea of civic nationalism is an idea of a nationalism that's entirely focused on political institutions, law, government, constitution, and so on. And I very much doubt that there are many people outside perhaps of academia, perhaps, who think of themselves only as having some kind of allegiance to a set of institutions. And I think if you look at when people study national identities empirically, what they find is that people have a kind of mixture of different elements that go into their national identities. Some of these may be ethnic. There are some people who actually think you can't belong to a nation unless your parents and grandparents were also members, though they're usually rather small in number. But for most people, cultural elements, language, all kinds of cultural elements, music, dance, costume, and so on, all of these things go into national identity. So it's never purely civic. It has these other elements too. And what's important, I think, is that these are also elements that people who enter can also come to adopt and integrate into. So, and I think this is important because it gives people a kind of emotional commitment to the people. And that, it seems to me, is what can sometimes be missing from political projects that have a highly rationalistic form, that just appeal to purely abstract principles. You need something motivational beyond the appeal just to pure principle. So, and this is sort of coming now to the question, Barry, that you asked. Why I think that the nation state has been a successful institution on balance, and acknowledging also the significant downsides that, again, Lea reminded us of, why it's been successful is it's channeled that emotional attachment and connected it to an institution that can actually achieve on a large scale various kinds of outcomes. So the smaller units that preceded it, the city-states, were just unable to cope with the kinds of technical, military and other advances that came in the early modern period. So it's really the scale question is about how you can connect something that people can identify with emotionally and therefore feel motivated to support with effectiveness as an instrument of public policy.
What happens, though, when we have, say, a tension between those cultural identities and national identity? I'm thinking here of cases like Corsica in France, where people feel a very strong sense of identity and are in a struggle against the idea of a much larger notion of national identity, where they're just a département and everything has to be the same way governed there as it would be in Paris or as it would be in the south of France. I mean, I wonder whether those emotional commitments that you see as the glue for social cohesion can also sometimes be the semtex that lead to nations falling apart. We think of what happened in the Balkans from time to time.
Yeah. So I think although we're asked to contemplate the nation state, you're absolutely right that the reality often has to be something that has a more complex form. It has to have subunits which also significant identity focuses. So I'm fully in favour of forms of devolution, federalism and so on that give expression to people's identities at different levels. But these can be encompassed within an overarching larger national framework. So on the Scottish question and the Catalan question, I'm a unionist, but I'm strongly in favour of autonomy for those regions because they are also, in their way, nations too, but they're nested within a larger unit. And so we have to be willing to evolve forms of political structure that actually respond to these different levels of identity.
So Lea, can I ask a similar question to you? I mean, if we're trying to build some sort of cohesion behind, say, a European project, do we need to still pay attention to those smaller regional identities which really do matter to people quite intensely, where their emotions are bound up with it, where the culture is bound up with it? I mean, I have heard that said that people who wanted just a European identity still wanted to put a big stress on the regions and the importance of the regions. Would that be possible to combine those two for you, or do you think we'd still have to, as it were, have what David thought of as a rather empty principle? We'd have to embody that in a more cohesive and socially convened way.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with the importance of emotions and the importance of national motivation as an empirical factor. I suppose that's maybe the difference between, British empiricism and German idealism, because I think emotions have to be directed by reason, and that the projects that they are attached to should be also plausible and scrutinized critically, not just by reference to other emotions and to other ways in which people feel, but by reference to arguments and judgments and, as I say, rationality that cannot be reduced simply to this emotional attachment. In addition to that, I would say that yes, it's possible to reflect and go back to regional allegiances and so on, but that is also then that becomes an objection to the nationalist, because if the nationalist is prepared to devolve downwards, why are they not prepared to transform looking upwards or outwards? So if we are willing to change the composition of the way in which we think about national institutions to give more autonomy to sub-state units, why can't we be prepared to change national institutions to connect them better to international and transnational units? So I think that would be the challenge.
I mean, in a way, there is a sort of resolution of that conflict. When the Scots thought of detaching themselves from the Union, they were happy to do that simply because there was the European Union to which they could belong and in which they would feel they had a home. It would be much less comfortable for them to do it apart from that. So, I mean, in some way, a lot of nations, and as you saw, a bit of fragmenting and fracturing of what were larger European states, they were happy to think their nationalism would flourish within that larger structure. So no contradiction, nationalism okay as long as it's approved of by the the superstructure?
It's not so much the superstructure, it's more a question of what kind of political interpretations and political projects is nationalism in the service of. And I don't think nationalism can be a political project in itself. It can only be a force that can be mobilized in support of certain political projects. But whether these projects are plausible or not cannot be decided with reference to nationalism. And one of the reasons for which nationalism right now takes this form of exclusive, ethnic, cultural, particularist nationalism, is precisely that a number of these more abstract, more general questions are resolved with reference to cultural elements and appeal to pure commonality and just how people think and feel about taking back control, where in fact what would be needed is more critical, reflective discourse, or what are the reasons for which people feel that they have lost control, how do they think about the crisis of the welfare state, what are the effects of austerity, and can they be reduced to a simplistic cultural understanding of the predicament that they're in. And my suspicion is that it cannot, and that in fact it's precisely the wrong diagnosis to give.
David? You agree?
No, I mean, I was thinking more about the issue of how to integrate nations into a larger unit. I mean, I think that what we have to work out is what are the kind of common rules that actually all national projects have to abide by. And we need therefore a kind of structure, and this is, I think, very relevant in the European context, a set of ground rules that would enable nations to live together harmoniously, but without at the same time reducing their degree of freedom to the point where people actually begin to find the framework constraining. And I think it's the European problem has been to try to strike that balance in a way that actually, so you do have, for example, strong human rights agenda. You have a kind of attempt to harmonize various kinds of legal structures. But I think it has to be done in such a way that people still feel that they can, if they want to make some radical economic experiment or cultural experiment or environmental experiment, they're not going to be constrained by external bureaucratic procedures that stop them doing it. So I think it's getting that kind of balance right.
But isn't it interesting that, I mean, I suppose you've both been talking about the historical foundations. I mean, when you looked at philosophical work on the foundation of the nation state, it tended to deal with it in a clearly much less globalized context, where people thought they could insist on how the state is founded, whether you go with Hobbes or Locke, but you were deciding what constituted having authority over your citizens, having cooperation from them, having a rule of law. But it was very much in a world in which the nation could decide for itself entirely what it wanted to do. So even if you felt constrained, say, by Europe, and I think it's been remarked many times that there's a certain amusement to be had that those who say we must get out of Europe because we don't want unelected people deciding what we should do, are happy to sign up to the WTO rules, unelected officials who decide what they should do in trade. So, I mean, is there some sense in which the nation state as you want to define it has to have some of these transnational superstructures? It's just a requirement for it to function.
Well, I think it's not. It's a requirement for it to function in a way that can be universalized, right? So, so if you're going to claim autonomy and the right to govern yourselves in certain ways, that has to be consistent with other people's equal rights to do the same, and therefore you have to have obviously an international framework. In the classical period, that was really just summed up by sovereignty and non-intervention. Mm-hmm. That was the rule. Mm-hmm. Clearly, that's no longer adequate because of economic and other technological, environmental developments that mean that what we do here is going to have all kinds of knock-on effects in other parts of the world. And so you have to have a much stronger framework of international cooperation in place. So I think it's a matter of getting the right kind of balance between those two.
Well, one more question for Lea, and then I want to invite all of you to share your thoughts and questions with our speakers. I mean, I wonder if there's a worry about some of these transnational bodies and the values they wish to uphold, because whereas nation states felt that they had the right and the authority to deal with trouble within their borders, it's because we think that there is some accepted notion of values such as human rights beyond the boundary that we have legitimized now, the idea of one state intervening in another. That one state or one large force goes and sorts out a problem in human rights elsewhere. And that actually is quite a modern change of the priorities. It used to be that within the nation you decided what was acceptable, and now you've got some principles which are prized above the integrity of a state. So are you worried about that?
I want to try and answer this question by thinking about the emergence of nationalism historically, and think about the moment in which the emergence of a national sovereign state and the national consciousness displaces communal loyalties. So let's say the life of a peasant is in his village, his community is the village, and suddenly they're told that there is a nation state that, you know, their particular commune has been reunified with. And so if you read, I don't know, Il Gattopardo, for example, or these Italian novels that speak about the reunification of Italy and the predicament of villagers living in Sicily who lived all their life in complete ignorance about what it was like to live in Piedmont, and suddenly found themselves being part of the same state as the people who were living in Piedmont. So when they were asked to go and fight on behalf of the nation state, or when they were asked to show their loyalty to the nation state, they were no less alienated from their nation state coming from these communal loyalties than I think current nation state citizens are from transnational institutions. Say the EU is a good example. So they were no less alienated. The villager in Sicily was no less alienated from the Italian central government than the citizen of Leeds is from the European Union right now. I think it was very similar. And this is a project that took obviously a very long time to be established, an institution that took a lot of historical and political effort to be consolidated, and that took the desirable forms that we think it took because of the way in which that project was mobilized in the service of a particular vision of radical egalitarian emancipation. That's my point. So I think we face a parallel problem with understanding the European Union, which is one of the reasons why I think one of the most deplorable effects of Brexit is that it's turned British society and perhaps also European society into lovers or haters of the European Union, when in fact the European Union is just an association of states that promotes a particular understanding of free trade and relies exclusively on particular market values. And that the problem is precisely that this project is defined by its commitment to the market. Now, no one falls in love with the free market, as someone has said. So no one falls in love with the European Union, but there are ways in which we could think about the European Union as something that can be reformed and can be turned into an agent that is not just a servant of the market, but something that promotes solidarity and cooperation amongst the people of Europe. That is the ideal of the European Union, and I think that is the thought that requires us to be both critical and supportive of the European Union, and that has been completely lost in the Brexit debate.
I never felt so European as when my nation state wanted to take it away from me, and then I really felt European. But I'm going to ask for questions now. There are microphones which will go round, I believe. Please put your hand up, and then a microphone will come to you. So I see a question at the back and a question in the middle. I can just ask you to wait till we get the microphones to you. Thank you. Yes. Yes. I think that's Hugh Miller at the back. I'm not sure, but it is.
Well, thank you. I thought that quite a lot of what has been said was off the point of the motion, which whether the nation state as an institution has outlived its usefulness. I take it the basis of it is that beyond a certain point, maybe the size of a village, you need some organization to make decisions which affect all the people within the scope of that organization, whether it's geographical or not. And the ones that are geographical, we've ended up calling nations, nation states. And when you say it's important, and I agree that it is important, the world being what it is, that there should be transnational organizations, that presupposes the existence of the nations which are the agents which cooperate in transnational institutions. When that disappears, as arguably as it were, the nations that were the states of the United States of America disappear, you get a single nation. That process, if it goes on, can only end up, it won't, but it could only end up in the whole world becoming a single nation state with no devolution to other things that deserve the name. And that, it seems to me, would pretty manifestly be a disaster, which neither of the speakers has addressed. And so for the time being, whatever view of what you think should be going on within nation states or what their policy should be, I would have thought the nation state, I haven't heard anything that suggests that the institution of nation state has ceased to be indispensable. And if it's indispensable, then that at least is an argument for its being useful.
Lea, I think this is one for you to start with.
So we talked about the contingent nature of nations and the fact that they emerged at a particular point in history, and we know that there wasn't, the whole world was not one nation before the nations existed, and there is no reason to speculate that the whole world will be one nation after the nations cease to become relevant. So I think there's different ways in which one can organize political life, and we talked about federal units, we talk about, people write about medieval forms of authority that take more localized forms of exercising political power. We don't know what technology makes possible and what forms of political rule will be made possible by technology. On that, it's important to remember that the transition from these communal forms of loyalty to the nation state were enabled by technological revolutions, by the facility of communication, the speed of communication, the means of communication. And we are arguably now at a similar point of technological revolution where, again, the means through which we get in touch with each other have radically changed. And so it's possible to also contemplate forms of political authority that respond to that. So I don't disagree with the fact that we will need, as a matter of fact, because we have nations, we will need nations in whatever process will emerge out of the crisis of the nation state as we know it now. But the point is that the nation state is at a crisis point now, is at a crisis moment. I was trying to indicate that I think the diagnosis for why that is the case is not only to do with the nation as a historical phenomenon and the fate of the nation and the way in which we understand culture, but also the particular conjuncture between the nation state and the emergence of global financialized capitalism. And so when we think about how the nation state is going to be changed, then we also ought to think about how is this current ways in which we organize economic relations going to be overcome, what form it will take in the future, and so on. So it's true that it's an important element, but when we talk about its usefulness, the fact that something is empirically a feature of reality doesn't make it a useful feature of reality. It might make it a useless feature of reality. So I think the fact that it's important and that it exists and it's there and it's present doesn't necessarily say anything about its desirability and usefulness. We tend to think of something that is not just present but also desirable.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman here.
Thank you. It struck me when the presentations were being made that the whole question was very, very European-centered. And I would like to ask the speakers, should we not, in a debate like this, also look at Russia, China, Indonesia, and the United States, and India, where you have a huge population mass in each case? And do they think that the debate then about whether a nation state has outlived its usefulness would be pursued along the same lines with respect to those great national entities?
Thank you. David, would you like to begin with that?
Thank you. Yes. I was reminded partly by the previous question as well, that of course the main real alternative to the nation state has been the empire of, whether it's the Russian Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Chinese Empire. So that's the main contender. And if you look at the history of Europe, it's really a contest between those two forms. I have to say my own enthusiasm is for the small nation state. I think the most successful examples, the ones that I think embody the virtues that I see in this form of organization, are relatively small countries. Switzerland, Sweden, Iceland, I think is a fantastic example. It shows you can be very small and yet very resilient in the face of global disaster. And I think that these larger units have struggled to develop the form of national identity and the political forms, the democratic political forms, that I would see as being the ideal model of a nation state. I think most of us think that the future of democracy in America is very much a question. Clearly doesn't exist in Russia or China. It so far has existed in India, but I think even there the pressures of size and scale make it actually quite hard to operate as a democratic system. And indeed, so I think that in these very large units, almost to compensate for the absence of a sense of direct involvement by the people with the political institutions, you tend to get these forms of nationalism, which I think Lea has rightly condemned as being irrational, ethnocentric, and so on. So I think that these are not good examples. And if I had to sort of depict the kind of future world that I would like to see, I would like to see these big units break up, actually, and we would have federations of much smaller units that would actually be, I think, a better kind of world. And so I'm not a fan of these big nations.
Take a question here, and then I'll come back round.
Thanks. If I might actually develop your point there about smaller federations of nations, I would argue that only when the human population is grouped into smaller cells or nations, as it were, can they accurately represent the will of the people. Because I would give the example of the Maldives, a country with a population of less than 500,000. However, when grouped together into a nation, they have a say on the world stage. Now, if it was a global democracy, for instance, these people would have very little say. However, as it is, they are able to, they take great pride in being one of the countries at the forefront of combating climate change due to the conditions of the Maldives being almost entirely within 2 or 3 meters above sea level. I would argue that only by grouping the population into smaller units, nations, can they have a, losing all my words, be fairly represented in the world.
So Athenians in the Agora, is that the way forward?
So I actually, my thought when I hear about small and large is that small and large depend on the unit of measurement that we have. And the units of measurement that we have are conventions that depend on what kind of technology we have available, what environment we're operating, how we're thinking about measuring, what we're trying to measure, how we're comparing what we're trying to measure. So something that would have been, so I don't know, the Colosseum was extremely huge when it was built. People could, thought of this as the biggest building they'd ever seen. But then now when you look at the Colosseum, it's big, but it's actually quite small. So all of these things are, the units of measurement are relative and depend on the historical moment in which we live and the way in which we make decisions about what we measure and so on. So it's all comparative.
But wasn't the point about whether they could operate so as to get together and discuss and share enough of a common view? I mean,
but sure, but that depends on the means of communication that we have available.
Yeah.
How long it takes us to communicate with each other, who it is that we want to communicate with. And what I'm saying is that depending on how technology changes, all of these things change as well. So our perception of the world, including our perception of size, what's big and what's small, and what's our unit of reference, change with the changes in scientific discoveries, with the changes in technology and so on. So I think it's sort of it seems to be very ahistorical and a very sort of abstract way of looking at it, to think, well, you know, Poland was a small country or Switzerland is a small country. It all depends on how we think about the world, and how we think about the world depends on what we have available, the means that we have available to reflect on the world.
So communication size doesn't matter?
Well, I think it's the issue is whether you can create what people call a public sphere.
Yeah.
What is a public sphere?
Yeah.
It's a set of places, media places, physical places, where people communicate to each other in a way that they can understand people who disagree with them, and then search for ways of reaching compromise and so on. So I think that scale is important, and where the units get very large, and this seems to me is what we see happening in the US at the moment, partly because of the sheer size of the country. The public sphere completely fragments, so it seems to me, and you have red states and blue states, and they hardly talk to each other. And this is not really a recipe for democracy, but for authoritarianism.
Nor is Twitter,
So
obviously.
I think, the public sphere fragments because of inequality, not because of size, and because of unequal access to opportunities for education and knowledge. And so one can have a very fragmented public sphere even in a small society where the opportunities for knowledge are unequal, and where there is hierarchies of epistemic empowerment that are in place and that actually prevent certain people from being participants of that public sphere.
But does it matter if there is a sort of public sphere for discourse? I mean, there's some sense in which that's just obviously not happening at the moment.
But the idea that public sphere for discourse requires physical proximity, I think, is something
No,
that
it
we
might
kind of...
require technological means, but at the moment I wonder whether that's really working for us.
Well, but
We've
the reason
got
it's not
bubbles,
working...
we've got spaces, people
The reason
not
it's not working
communicating.
is that 2/3 of the world don't have access to these things because they're poor.
I think the ones who do are still not talking to each other, but we'll take more questions. Yeah, we've got a man with a microphone and another about to get one. Yeah.
Thank you all for being here tonight. My question is, are international organizations such as the United Nations, IMF, are they truly international, or are they simply tools or vehicles for the elite countries like the United States, like Germany? And then along with that, how ought these organizations be integrated into your respective political organization of the world, whether it be nation states or something else?
Lea.
Yeah, great. So are they truly international? No. Is the EU truly representative of the peoples of Europe? I'm from Albania, and it's a country that is trying to access the EU, and I can tell you that the EU acts as a neo-colonial power with regard to the countries that are seeking access to it, and that there is very much an axis of hegemonic power that exercises that power to benefit certain elites, German government, against other groups, Greek population. So I think these inequalities pervade these transnational institutions, but they pervade domestic institutions too. They pervade the nation states as well. So it's not the case that there is a power and inequality and wealth asymmetry in the case of transnational institutions where a few elites dominate the institution and everything else in the nation state is fine, because I think exactly the same thing happens in the nation state as well. In Britain, there is an elite that controls the economy and the means of political participation. And we see the effects of that. We see the effects of ignorance. We see the effects of unequal participation in the public sphere, in citizens' competence to actually communicate in the public sphere. So it's not that different. So there's no reason to worry about one more than to worry about the other. And there's no reason to seek to transform one without connecting to the other.
I mean, I think that as far as international organizations like the UN go, I think you just have to be realistic about what you can expect from them. Of course, they're subject to power differentials, that's absolutely correct. They may still have certain functions that are important. I think on the whole, the United Nations itself has lost influence over the last period, and it's partly because countries like the US actually, rather than controlling it, have tended just to back away from it and to use other channels to promote their interests globally. So I think you have to be you have to approach this on the assumption that states are going to regard these international institutions as essentially bargaining forums where they will try to advance their interests. And in some cases, it may be possible, as I think did happen in the Paris Accord on climate change, something good comes out of it. But one shouldn't hope for too much. I think that's realism's the note, I think, here.
Gentleman here has been waiting for a while. Yes.
I want to mention that the term society and definition society wasn't mentioned. Later you mentioned about it. And it's actually disappeared from the political lexicon. And Oxford English Dictionary should be amended with tag archaic. The national identity is based actually in nation state based on the society with its culture, language, history, and so on. And what's happening now, because after the Second World War, approximately 1 billion people moved from the East to the West. And what we experience now, it's a Western problem. It led to the ghettoization of the society. We have communities, we don't have society anymore. And this ghettoization created a problem within any nation. The big corporation, Lea mentioned transnational, they are just banking and corporations. Their agenda to have as cheap as possible labor in all the countries and manage the economy. And technically, the economy and the banks managed by the International Bank for Clearance, which owns all central banks of 164 countries. So we experience a problem trying to solve out what the nation is. If you don't manage your house, it doesn't belong to you.
Thank you. What I'm going to do is challenge my speakers, because I'm going to try and get as many questions in and then ask you to sort of pick them up as we go. So there's a woman just there. If you put your hand up, the microphone will come to you. Thank you. And then gentleman over here. And then I think I've got 1, 2, and I saw a third somewhere. Yes, I did. Good. Thanks. Please.
My point is just kind of going back to a little bit about the size thing and the devolution thing. It's just a case of, like you were saying, like your examples of some good countries, like Switzerland, for example, and Iceland, versus not devolving here. But I think when we're talking about things like the public sphere and people having their own voices, it could be argued that in this country, a lot of people would think that it's exceptionally centralised as a country, and many of the voices from around, like, you know, Wales, the north of England, Scotland, etc., don't feel they have any say whatsoever in what happens. Obviously, that's the most extreme view, but they don't get a say at all. So how do you actually decide, like, what should be a nation, if there's going to be a nation state, and how do people have any control over that?
Okay, good. I'll take this question and then I'll ask you to pick that up as you this gentleman here. Thanks.
Thank you. It seems that both of you are agreed that social forms end, and in particular the nation state will one day die. I wonder where you place the nation state at this point of time. Is it healthy? Is it terminally ill but we haven't diagnosed it yet? Is it on the death spiral? Do we have a replacement that is half-baked? Do we have a replacement ready to go? Where exactly on that spectrum are we, and where do you think we need to be for you to win your side of the debate? Where's the cutoff point beyond which one person wins and the other person loses?
Okay, so we've got some questions that have been... You're still writing, but who would like to start?
Shall I have a go?
Mm-hmm.
So the question about how do we know what a nation is, or what level do we identify it? Because you're of course absolutely right that local power is important as well. I mean, I think So Lea, I think, at one point in her talk, quoted Ernst Renan, the idea that nation is a daily plebiscite. So I think it's a good phrase, because what it reminds us of is the fact that national identities are in constant evolution. The content of them is, but also who's included in them. And this is part of that is also whether how far people begin to transfer their allegiance, as we've seen in the case, for example, of Britain and Scotland, from the larger unit to the smaller one. Over time, you can actually trace this process. I think it's not something. I mean, in a way, it's not something that we can steer from above. I think people do it themselves. They themselves decide over time what their national allegiances are going to be and what shape they're going to take. So, is a nation state in decline was the other question. I mean, I do think that probably people's national identities mean less to them now than they did 30 or 40 years ago. There are various reasons for that. I think that the rise of highly individualized identities has had a tendency to displace national identity as a kind of way of understanding who we are. And I think that this has certain problems with it that we need to recognize. I mean, I tried to emphasize in my talk the importance of collective action, taking action together on things. And I think one of the disturbing features of the present time is the extent to which we're subject to the unintended consequences of individual actions, partly through economic forces, capitalist forces, but also I think partly through changes in people's lifestyles and ways of doing things that have consequences on a large scale that we don't actually have the resources to control. So it's dysfunctional effects of individual behavior often are harder to control, where people's sense of solidarity on the large scale diminishes. So I think, so one of the, I don't want to say too much here, but Lea, I think, rightly at one point drew attention to the fact that when national identities were evolving, there was a certain amount of top-down input. So states tended to use various mechanisms to encourage people to have strong national identities. That undoubtedly was the case. Today, I think, because of our embrace of liberal ideas, which are valid in their own right, it's much actually harder to engage in positive nation building. But actually, I probably think that's what we need. We need some nation building to increase our solidarity. I think
Good, thank you. Lea?
I guess I would say we need cosmopolitan nation building. So it's true that we need to mobilize the nation, but we need to mobilize the nation for goals that require the overcoming of the nation itself. Because I think currently the structure of the predicament and the embeddedness of the nation sovereign state within globalized capitalism is such that it's very difficult given the degree of interdependence and economic indebtedness and sovereign debt and so on. The pressures that capitalism puts on sovereign states are such that I think it's very difficult to rely just on nationalism to kind of rejuvenate itself. So that speaks to the first question also about the kind of economic constraints on nationalism and the power of corporations, and the idea that I was trying to also introduce when I presented the debate about the extent to which austerity is connected to the dominance of ethnic nationalism. So the idea that there are these projects that take a very particularistic form, but for reasons that have nothing to do with cultural conflict, but that are in fact related to conflicts of a different kind. How do we decide at what point, what is the nation, where are we at with the nation, at which point is the nation now? I wish we could tell. Hegel says that the owl of Minerva only flies when it's dusk,
In the evening,
I'm not sure it's dusk yet when it comes to the nation, at least when it comes to the kind of the empirical manifestation that this agent takes. But I think at the moment, and this is one of the reasons for which I'm pessimistic on this more worthy form of nationalism, which I was trying to emphasize, is civic nationalism, is that it seems very difficult for an enlightened kind of nationalism to cope with the pressures of transnational corporations and financialized capitalism and so on. And so it looks as if ethnocultural nationalism is very much alive and strong, but the answers that are required to respond to that are not yet there. And part of it has to do with the fact that we're at this transition moment where I think we don't have the political loyalty to a project that would be different from the nationalistic one.
Great, thank you. Now I'm going to have a lightning round of questions to try and get the remaining questioners in. So I'm just going to remind our questioners that a question is a sentence that ends with a question mark. Okay, just so that we make sure we're all on the same page here. Lady here, and then the gentleman here, and I'll try and get round to those who've already been in. Okay, please.
Yeah. How important do you think is leadership in the idea of the ideas that you've been talking about?
Great question. Yeah. Great question. Thank you, gentleman here.
Yes, I feel torn in this debate because I agree with Lea Ypi that the European Union can be reformed, and I also agree with Lea Ypi that British empiricism needs to be countered with a good dose of German idealism in order that emotion is countered with reason. But it comes to my attention that it was Kant, for some people, the originator of German idealism, who wrote a lot about cosmopolitanism, and it was Hegel, who was much further down the line in German idealism, who didn't write about cosmopolitanism and wrote about the nations and what the projects of the nations were. And that suggests to me that there's something too utopian about the idea of cosmopolitanism without some very clear guidelines of where that cosmopolitanism is going and how it relates to the nation states that exist.
Thank you. So, gentleman over there now. Well, as you know, as we say in Scotland, Hume's only crime was waking Kant from his dogmatic slumbers. Please.
I remember that gentleman said it will be very difficult to extract disentangle us from this current nationhood infrastructures, because everything's so mired in nationhood infrastructures. I'm just wondering, considering current situation, if it is possible to move into a direct democracy, because proxy democracy is really based on 19th century's, how to say, inconvenience of mobilities, educations, and knowledges. Now, everybody carries mobile phones, and it's possible to, how to say, vote on smartphones. Like some Swiss cantons, it is not impossible to move into direct democracies. And this may take us into something new, how to say, not necessarily nation-related sort of infrastructure, something new where people can participate across the world.
Good, thank you. Okay, so it's a question about direct democracy. And gentleman just here.
Make it very fast. Thank you for this. I want to go back to one of the first things that Professor Miller was talking about, which is the great kind of unique achievements of states, the cultural achievements that they're able to have. But essentially those achievements, academies and museums and other things, are not things that states are able to do uniquely. And the thing that states are able to do uniquely is create warfare on a scale that nothing else could do. And so I'm wondering if the bare fact of being able to kill more and faster, being the one thing really in favor of states, really amounts to a normative defense.
Okay, thank you. I'm really going to whip round. There's a gentleman here with a microphone, and we have to get one to the back, and then I'm going to stop. Yes?
Testing.
It should be on. Just speak directly into it like this.
Well, it sounds as if the state is an artificial construct, but of course it's not.
And it evolved precisely because you had things like the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, etc. And the state evolved because of cultural similarities, linguistic similarities, etc., and the ability to defend yourself in answer to the other question. So you get the sense that there's something wrong with it. There isn't something wrong with it because, again, it's a set of values. And if you look at today's world, and you take, for example, the European Union, you've got Greece on the one hand, which actually lied to get into the European Union. You've got Germany on the other hand. So you have a range of different cultural values. So in terms of then saying, well, let's have transnational entities, what is a transnational entity except built up from individual countries? And again, I'm afraid to say the history of those has been total corruption.
I saw a question in there. Good. Question at the back, and then we'll try to do a wrap on all of these.
Hi there. Thank you. Just one quick question. Is the nation state only dead because the people are not giving the answers that the elite want to hear?
Okay. I'm going to tie that to direct democracy question. Maybe those could be dealt with together. We also had Kant versus Hegel. We had leadership. We've got building up from the cultural traditions. And I'm misremembering what was said here, but I'm hoping that one of you has held on to it. Okay. Take it from wherever you like.
Okay, so maybe I'll start with leadership and perhaps connect that to the issue of direct democracy and to the relationship between the people and the elite. So I guess one of the problems that we're witnessing now with the European Union is that there is a lot of leadership but not sufficient accountability to democratic processes of will formation. And so elites and leaders can get a lot of things done, but they cannot do them in a way that is stable and sustainable in the long term when they lack democratic accountability. So I guess while it's important to defend this idea that any project, any emancipatory project needs to be taken forward by some agent, it's also very important to think about what kind of agent is that agent going to be and how is it going to connect to processes of will formation, including processes of national will formation like the ones that David was mentioning, including attempts to revise direct democracy, deliberative democracy, participatory forms of making decisions and so on. Kant versus Hegel. So I think Hegel was a good critic of Kant, but Marx was an even better critic of Hegel. And so the answer to that dilemma about the relationship between cosmopolitanism and the state is in Marx's critique of Hegel's state. And that without that, we are stuck in these kind of two abstract positions where we have the cosmopolitanism of the will and good willing on the one hand and the particularism on the state. And these two are unable to, each of them, satisfy the promises that they set each other to satisfy. And that's why they need to be overcome in the direction of a different project. It reminded me, mentioning Marx, that Marx also has a kind of, I think it's probably not going to be very popular, but it is one idea of what a post-national world would be like, which is the world where the state has withered away, where you have communities, including communities that might have national participation or where, you know, emotions, local loyalties get devolved at smaller units, but where the form of political cooperation, globally speaking, is more spontaneous. So that's another, there's the empire as the past, but there could be the withering away of the state as the future.
Great. And David, could you please take up this gentleman's question, which I very rudely couldn't remember, but it seemed important at the time, and I want you to pick it up.
Sorry.
Yes.
The one about war?
Yes, the one about war.
Yes.
Thank you.
So you're absolutely right that nation states historically have been instruments of war. I don't think that their record on that front is worse than all the other forms of political organization that human beings have, right? I mean, it's pretty grim, however you look at it. But I think it's also true that in the, at least in the last 150 years, the democratic nation states have evolved rules for governing their own interrelationships that have actually largely eliminated warfare between democracies. And I think this is a major achievement. And there's no reason to think that that's not going to persist. So I think there's been a sea change, and I mean, I can't, you know, I'm not a Kantian, but I think actually Kant's cosmopolitanism was more sensible than many of his latter-day followers, because he saw the importance, actually, and the importance both of the state and of its cultural singularity. And so he was looking for perpetual peace, which took the form of a league between states to outlaw war. And in a sense, you could argue that what we've seen, I mean, the major achievement, obviously, of Europe has been precisely to deliver on that Kantian idea. So, though, like the chair, I'm a Humean at heart, I'm prepared to give Kant credit for that rather good idea. On direct democracy, if I could just say, but I think direct democracy is great, but referendums not so great. I think the message is that for direct democracy to be a good instrument of governance, you have to have an interacting and informed public. So when you have these experiments in direct democracy of citizen juries and that kind of thing, people are just chosen randomly and asked to look in detail at some issue. They're very encouraging results. So I think there's not a problem about trusting the people. But the problem is that if you just throw a question at people who are basically atomized and only sort of interacting in little internet bubbles, and you don't have a public sphere and interchange and deliberation, then it can also be dangerous. So I think it's a matter of direct democracy, yes, when the conditions are right for it.
Okay, I'm going to ask each of my speakers to have a closing statement, and then we're going to put it to the vote. So, Lea, would you start us off, please?
Yes, so what is the closing statement? The closing statement is that civic nationalism used to be a good thing, that it's unable to cope with the pressures of global financialized capitalism, and that it's time to think about forms of political agency and political mobilization that really are able to respond to the challenges of contemporary politics without giving way to the emergence of ethno-cultural nationalism and dangerous exclusionary forms of political will formation.
That's admirably brief and clear. Thank you. David?
So I want just again to say that the problems and defects of contemporary nation states that Lea eloquently described are entirely apropos. But what we're debating here is the idea of a nation state and its future. And so you can be as reformist as you like, and I'd be pretty reformist on many of the issues to do with citizenship, immigration, the treatment of poor people that Lea mentioned. But I would also want to argue that the political institutions have been most successful in dealing with these issues, particularly in dealing with the problem of poverty, have always had a national basis. Because again, that's the arena in which large-scale solidarity has been in evidence. So I think the issue is, my pitch is for reforming the nation state, and the challenge to the other side is to say what actually you would do in its place if you don't like it.
Right. So now we participate in a little bit of voting and democracy, because we're going to address the motion with a show of hands from this entirely representative sample that we've brought together here out of your bubbles. So remember, the motion is the nation state is an institution which has outlived its usefulness. For the motion, can I see a show of hands? Against the motion? Hard to call, might just be shaded, but what it shows is that it's a beautifully balanced group of people that we brought together to debate and discuss this. So I'd like to start by thanking all of you for coming along. Thanks to the Royal Institute of Philosophy for putting on the debate. And will you join me in thanking our speakers, Lea Ypi and David Mitchell. Miller. David Miller.